there were two main drivers of the rise of larger and more complex societies. The first of these was agriculture. The second major factor, unfortunately, turned out to be warfare. At the core of tribalism is a sense of identity. Research in social identity theory has shown that we all have basically two kinds of identities. On the one hand, we all have a personal self, qualities that make us unique as individuals. But on the other hand, we're also typically members of groups. Sometimes we're a member of many different groups wearing lots of different hats. Most people, most of the time, see their personal and group identities as pretty distinct and separate. So if you make people's group identities salient to them, their personal identities become less accessible. Partly for this reason, psychologists often describe group identification as depersonalizing. It's a bit like your group identity can eclipse and obscure your sense of self. But there's also another very powerful form of group alignment known as identity fusion, in which your personal identity and your group identity become fused together. If you're fused with a group, your personal and group identities are activated together synergistically. So when your personal self is made salient, your group identity is made salient at the same time. And this fosters an enhanced sense of inner strength and invulnerability. And it works the other way around as well. If you make the group salient to a fused individual, this taps directly into a sense of personal agency. People who are highly fused with a group say that they'll do pretty much anything to protect their fellow group members, risking or even laying down their own lives to save them. People become fused in two main ways. One way is to undergo an experience that becomes a core feature of who you are, such as a frightening ordeal like fighting together on the battlefield, or maybe undergoing some kind of agonizing initiation ritual with other people. When experiences like these become not only part of your personal identity, but are also felt to be group defining, your personal and group identities effectively become fused together. Another way of becoming fused is to believe that you're made of the same physical substance as other group members. For example, people in the same family typically think they share the same blood or bones or some other physical traits. Often this notion of shared biology is scaled up so that members of the same tribe believe they're descended from the same common ancestors, or they might think of their territory as a motherland or fatherland. In large studies of twins, we've shown that both these elements contribute to feelings of fusion among siblings. For example, we found that identical twins are more fused than fraternal twins based on feeling more biologically similar. But independently of those effects, twins who think that they've been profoundly shaped by the same life experiences become fused in that way as well. The fusion of personal and group identities is very different from identification, which is the more depersonalizing form of group bonding I mentioned a bit earlier, where you simply share the same beliefs and practices as other people in the tribe, but there's no real sense of connection into your personal self. Now, fusion is an incredibly powerful form of group bonding. If you're fused with your group and it comes under attack, you'll do pretty much anything it takes to protect it, even if that requires acts of violence in many cases. We've shown in studies with a wide range of groups, from hardline Islamists to football hooligans, that fusion plays a crucial role in willingness to defend the group, even at grave personal risk. But it's one thing to make claims like that. It's quite another actually to lay down your life for the group. We therefore needed to find a population who not only talk the talk, but walk the walk, actually were willing to lay their lives down for one another when the chances of being killed in the process were very high. An opportunity to do this arose in 2011 during the Arab Spring, when one of my collaborators, Brian McQuinn, managed to get into Libya in the midst of the revolution using his UN contacts. With his help, I was also able to come to Misrata, and together we designed a survey with insurgent groups where Over 2,000 rebels and civilians had recently been killed in their efforts to repel Gaddafi's forces. This is a photo of me and Dr. McQuinn in what was once a crowded marketplace in the heart of Misrata, where Gaddafi's forces tried to hide their tanks, well, ineffectually, as you can see, from NATO airstrikes. Our survey was run with 179 members of various revolutionary battalions, or katiba in Arabic. Half our sample were frontline fighters, and half provided support to the frontline fighters, for example, by driving vehicles or ambulances or fixing broken engines and that kind of thing. Among the overwhelming majority of insurgents, we recorded ceiling levels of fusion with several groups, including family, friends in the Katiba you were in, and even fusion with people they'd never met from other battalions. Whereas by contrast, we found close to zero levels of fusion with fellow Libyans who supported the revolution. So these people on the same side ideologically, but not members of a Katiba. In other words, it didn't seem to matter that people shared your beliefs or were on the same side as you. What matters was being a member of these groups that had suffered together. Next, we said to participants in our survey, okay, we get that you're fused with multiple groups, but if you had to choose one, which would it be? In other words, a forced choice question. And here we found a striking difference between the frontline fighters and the providers of logistical support. If you were a frontline fighter, you were far more likely to choose your friends in the Katiba over your own family. This was a really striking finding because it meant that your fellow fighters were more like family than your actual family. And with providers of logistical support, that wasn't the case. All this made sense in terms of our theory. That is, we expected those who suffered more shared dysphoria, let's say, on the front line to be more fused. But we couldn't rule out the alternative possibility. What if fusion was what was driving these fighters to the front line in the first place? To try to adjudicate on that question, we ran a series of studies with US troops who'd served in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and in Iraq, but who crucially had no control over their own deployment. And we found that here again, intensity of suffering on the front lines was associated with higher scores on fusion with your unit. And this was compelling support for our hypothesis that shared suffering on the front lines was really what was driving the extreme levels of fusion. Now, identity fusion evolved in small groups, binding together people in face-to-face communities in which people knew each other personally. So the big question is, how did we get from that kind of small-scale group bonding to much larger scale phenomena like nationalism, or strong commitment to transnational religions and ethnic identities? Many attempts have been made to answer that question. Up until recently, scholars have tried to explain the evolution of complex societies using detailed case studies. And that's very useful, of course, but the approach is also vulnerable to selection bias in a big way. One way around that problem is to analyze patterns in global history statistically using very large databases. Nearly 15 years ago, I started work with Peter Turchin and Peter Francois to create SEISHAT, Global History Data Bank. It's a huge repository of data on the human past going back some 10,000 years. And we now have hundreds of collaborators on the project. Our analyses of the data so far suggest that there were two main drivers of the rise of larger and more complex societies. The first of these was agriculture. As societies became increasingly dependent on farming, and as crop cultivation and animal domestication became more and more sophisticated and intensive, this led to more complex political systems capable of supporting bureaucracies, professional priesthoods, elites, etc. The second major factor, unfortunately, turned out to be warfare. A series of major upsweeps in military technology drove the rise of states and empires in world history. But success in war is only partly explainable by technological innovation. The reason why some empires became so successful militarily is that they developed more effective methods of creating cohesion in their fighting forces. This was partly about vertical cohesion, the ability of leaders to command highly trained troops to obey strategically well-designed commands in a sort of top-down fashion. But it was also about horizontal cohesion, the willingness of military personnel to fight and die for each other. So we come back to tribalism. In my book, I trace the processes by which military cohesion was scaled up over the millennia, culminating in the emergence of religions capable of fusing not only people to extended groups, but also to the core doctrines that define those groups. In essence, these doctrines eventually became sacred values, ideas worth dying for, and forms of colonial imperialism emerged in which it became a moral obligation to wage holy wars to bring humanity under the umbrella of a single divinely sanctioned belief system, or to kill the heathens and heretics who refused. All of this has relevance to understanding contemporary violence too, whether we're talking about revolutionary insurgents, soldiers in conventional armies, or indeed suicide bombers. For example, building on these findings, I teamed up with Julia Ebner, an expert on extreme groups who'd been studying them undercover. Together, we came up with a plan to identify would-be terrorists before it's too late. One of the biggest problems facing the intelligence community is how to spot the terrorists among a vastly larger population of ideological extremists who espouse unpleasant views, but are unlikely ever to actually carry out acts of violence themselves. So Julia and I set out to develop a set of methods for analysing statistically the writings of political activists to spot the sort of telltale psychological signals or traits that we predicted would lead to acts of violent extremism. The deadly cocktail we were looking for consisted of four elements, really: fusion with the in-group, a strong belief that the in-group is under threat, demonization of the enemy, and the willingness to use violence if necessary. The aim of our analysis was to pick out language used by political activists as telltale indicators of this deadly cocktail of ingredients. What we found was that the killers in our sample were far more likely to exhibit the four features of the deadly cocktail than those who were non-violent, even those who subscribed to extremist ideologies. This supports the view that ideological extremism alone is not the driver of violence. The roots lie in a combination of factors, what we call our deadly cocktail. This award-winning research is now helping the intelligence community in the UK and in Germany, and also internet platforms, to spot would-be terrorists through their online communications. And now Julia and I are applying the same approach to the speeches of authoritarian leaders around the world in order to predict better which of these leaders will be next to unleash mass violence against their perceived enemies. But what if the same forms of tribalism that drive people to violence could also be harnessed to create bonds uniting opposing groups, even uniting enemies at war? This is a problem I've been working on with behavioral economist Lucas Reinhardt, to investigate whether shared experiences of the horrors of warfare could motivate fusion across enemy lines. We enlisted the help of a politician. Shortly after the Hamas attacks in October 23, John Alderdice, who'd been a key figure in brokering the peace in Northern Ireland, gave an impassioned speech in the House of Lords, arguing that yet more violence in Gaza was not the solution. After reading the speech, it struck me that it might be more effective if it emphasized shared sufferings on both sides of the Israel-Hamas conflict. So I rewrote the speech a bit and asked Lord Alderdice to let me film him presenting this new version. We then showed the speech to a large sample of Americans, half of whom were Jewish and supported Israel's side in the conflict, and half of whom were Muslims and supported the people of Gaza. And we found that listening to the speech made people more trusting of those on the other side in this conflict and more open to friendship with them. Even more remarkably, when we repeated these measures with the same participants several days after hearing this very short speech, we found that much of the positive attitude change was still present. In other words, the speech continued to impact people for some time afterwards, making the prospect of openness to peace seemingly more achievable. With these ideas in mind, my colleagues and I have been thinking increasingly about how we could harness the power of fusion.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.